Hello, namaskar from New Delhi, and good afternoon from Paris, and late good evening from Sydney. So I am Vijay Kranti, and today we are going to be together for about 1.5 hours on the subject 71 years of China's colonial rule in Tibet. Uh, I will very quickly take some time to introduce uh, the organizers and our panelists, and then after that, uh, a little introduction of today's subject, and then the main speakers will be with you. So, this webinar is being organized jointly by two organizations. One is the Center for Himalayan Asia Studies and Engagement, and other is Tibetan Youth Congress. And today we will have three experts with us. One is Mr. Pierre Antoine Donnet from France. Then we will have Dr. Qin Jin from Sydney, and Yudon Aukatsag from Sikkim. So I welcome our panelists, and we are expecting our other colleague, Professor Ayushi Ketkar, to join us to handle the question answer session. I hope she joins us very soon. So, to give you a very quick introduction to the organizers, the Center for Himalayan Asia Studies and Engagement, in short, if you say it's a CHASE, it's focused on understanding issues which are impacting countries and societies in and around Himalayan Asia region from an Indian perspective. It's a think tank and a meeting platform for exchange of knowledge, views, and perspectives among Indians and international experts, researchers, writers, advocacy groups who have been having keen interest in various aspects of political, social, economic, and strategic developments in this region. And then Tibetan Youth Congress is a, an internationally based organization from Dharamsala of Tibetan diaspora. So they are united in their common struggle for the restoration of complete independence of whole of Tibet, which means Utsang, Dutu, and Dome. So it's an independent organization with its own constitution, and it's independent of the Tibetan government in exile. So it has its own uh, area of influence and its own, yeah, of course, area of functioning. And it's the largest organization in the Tibet among the Tibetan diaspora. And if I can say that all over the world, when you see any Tibetan active or an Tibetan official who is working on behalf of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, there are very good chances that uh, this individual must have gone through Tibetan Youth Congress, because Tibetan Youth Congress has functioned as a nursery for the Tibetan youths in social and political their development. So today's subject, the 1771 years of China's colonial rule in Tibet. The main reason why we are doing it today is that 2 days ahead, 10th March, will be 72nd anniversary, or 71st anniversary of the Tibetan People's Uprising in Lhasa, in Tibet, against the Chinese colonial rule. This uprising was unfortunately crushed, and it happened in 1959. As a result of this, His Holiness the Dalai Lama had to escape from Tibet to India, and since then, he is living in India. And Tibetans with him are striving to regain uh, the original status of independent Tibet. So today we are observing the 71st anniversary of Tibetan uprising, and that's why we are together here. And to give a short introduction of our panelists, we have Mr. Pierre Antoine Donnet, who is a veteran French journalist and is a very well known expert on China and Tibet. As a journalist, he has a very long experience in reporting and writing about China. He has been posted in Beijing from 1984 to 1989 as a correspondent in the news bureau of Agence France Presse, AFP, as we know it very popularly. And he has also served AFP as its global chief news editor. He's a senior journalist and he's author of two books on China and Tibet. His first book was on Tibet. The title was Tibet, Dead or Alive. It was published in 1990 and it has appeared in many other languages. And his latest second book is China, the Great Predator. It was published last year. He is one of those journalists who understands Chinese language very well. So he has a good peep into the Chinese mind and he understands when there are developments, political developments in China. He is one of those who can predict and understand those developments well. Then we have Dr. Qin Jin. Dr. Qin Jin, he is of Chinese origin and he's a very well-known scholar and a leader among the democracy-supporting community of Chinese diaspora. He is based in Sydney in Australia and currently he is the chairman of the Federation of a Democratic China, which is a joint platform of Chinese groups which are striving for democracy in China. And he has been earlier the joint general secretary of the Joint Working Committee for the Chinese Democratic Movement, which included three major organizations striving for democracy in China. He has written widely in newspapers on human rights situation inside China and its political developments in China. So his book, My Quest for Democracy in China, was published in 2012, and he has done his doctorate from Australia. So we are happy we have two scholars who are non-Tibetans but understand Tibet so well. And then we have one very prominent Tibetan with us, Ms. Yudon Aukatsang. Yudon is a very well-known name. She is member of the Tibetan Parliament in Exile, and it is an elected body where the representatives are elected through secret vote from across the world by Tibetans. And this is fourth time that she has been elected to the supreme body of Tibetan diaspora, the Tibetan Parliament in Exile. And it goes without saying that she is a popular woman leader. Over past more than 15 years, I think 20 years, she has been associated with various organizations of Tibet. The one major organization was Empowering the Vision Project. She has been its director and a trustee of secretary trust of the trust. And her earlier associations included Tibetan Women's Association, Tibetan Center for Human Rights and Development, and CREDA. So we have three such experts who understand Tibet very well and who have observed the developments inside Tibet, in China, and among Tibetan diaspora. So welcome all three of you. And we are very lucky to have all three of you together on a very important day. So now may I request Mr. Antoine Donnet to please start your presentation. Each speaker will have about 15-20 minutes. It's not rigid, but all of you will have 15-20 minutes. And after your presentations are over, then our colleague, I hope she can join us, Professor Ayushi Ketkar, to handle question answers. All our audience who want to ask questions, please go to the chat box and your questions will be picked up for question answer session. So, Donnet, the floor is for you.
Thank you. First of all, I would say that I'm very honored to be talking together with the other two distinguished guests. I would like to stress that I had a very great interest on Tibet for a long time. Actually, from my childhood, when I read this book, Tintin au Tibet, Tintin in Tibet, and reading that book gave me ideas to go there one day. So when I was posted in Beijing, as you said, from 1984 to 1989, I really had a great interest in going to Tibet. And I asked the Chinese authorities many times to be allowed to go to Tibet. And one day they phoned me and they said, Mr. Donnet, we give you the permission to go to Tibet on one condition, is that when you are there in Tibet, you will not write any stories about what you see. So that was the precondition. And without that condition, I couldn't go to Tibet. So that's why I said yes. So then I went to Tibet together with my wife on August 1985. And at that time, for the first time, the Chinese administration allowed foreigners to get inside Tibet without a guide on their own. So for us, that was very precious. So together with my wife, we stayed for about 2 weeks in Tibet. And I must say that that was a tremendous shock for me because I didn't expect to hear all the Tibetan monks telling me what they endured. And they spoke to me in Chinese. For one reason is that they learned Chinese in the Chinese jail. So what they told me was atrocious. They told me about how they had been tortured and so forth. So after that, I couldn't remain silent. I had to share that with readers. So I decided to write stories. And so when I wrote those stories, the next day I was summoned to the information department of the Chinese Foreign Ministry. And they told me, Mr. Donnet, you broke your promise. And because you broke your promise, you will not be allowed to go to Tibet anymore. After that, I could go to Kham and Amdo, and from there I could still meet Tibetans and visit temples. And after that, I thought that since I'm not allowed to go back to Tibet, I'm going to write a book. And that's when I started collected informations about Tibet from Tibetan sources, from Chinese sources, from foreign sources. And in 1987, I decided to go to Dharamsala to meet His Holiness. So I went there to Dharamsala, also together with my wife, and I had the privilege to have an audience with His Holiness. And I remember very well on that day, he told me, Mr. Donnet, you are the first foreign reporters working in Beijing going to see me in Dharamsala. So he was very happy. So we had a long talk. And after that, I met him several times, either in Dharamsala or in Paris or in other places in the world. So let me speak about Tibet today. First of all, I would like to tell a few words about the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976. So that's a terrible period, lasted for 10 years. And for Tibet, that was an awful time because the Red Guards, they looted monasteries, they put them on fire. Tibetan monks, again, were put into jail. So it was a very big hardship for the Tibetan people. And at the end of the Cultural Revolution, there was a kind of opening up. You must remember that Chairman Deng Xiaoping in 1978 launched the economic reforms for China. So that was a kind of benediction for the Chinese people because by doing so, they could somewhat forget what was their life during the Cultural Revolution. And opening up China with economic reforms, uh, permitted China to become, in a matter of a few decades, the second world economy in the world. So for Tibet, that also meant some kind of opening up. Mr. Hu Yaobang in the 70s went to Tibet, and he was the one in the Chinese leadership who, when he saw all these destructions, wept. He cried and he said, "Look, my friends, my Chinese friends, what we have done in Tibet." He was the only one. After that, no one spoke in that terms about Tibet. After that, Tibet was closed again, and especially since President Xi Jinping took power in 2012. Since then, communication with the Tibetan people is very, very difficult. The Tibetans who have families abroad are very afraid to contact them because if they do so, the next day the Chinese security would come to their home and they would question them. So they would be in a terrible situation. It's exactly the same for their families abroad. They don't dare to contact their families in Tibet because they know very well that by doing so, that would make their Tibetan families inside Tibet in danger. So I would like to talk a little bit about His Holiness' position. One thing that I share with him, among many other things, is that he is for non-violence. Despite all the hardship for the Tibetan people, he rejects violence for a long time already. And by doing so, some of the Tibetan people living abroad uh, were not very happy with that because, especially in the Tibetan Youth Congress, I remember I met some of their leaders when I went to Dharamsala. They were for violence. But let's talk about violence. It's going nowhere. Uh, if Tibetans use violence, they did sometimes, but by doing so, they will be crushed even more. So, non-violence is the only way to progress. And His Holiness also tried for a long period of time to find a compromise with the Chinese authorities. There were contacts which lasted years and years between the Tibetan administrations and the Chinese authority, especially in Delhi, with the Chinese embassy in Delhi. But that also went to nowhere. And since the arrival of Mr. Xi Jinping, there is no more contacts anymore. His Holiness also decided to abandon his political role. And I think this is very positive. By doing so, he gave the political power to the Kashag, knowing that it would take a long time for the Kashag to learn what is democracy. Democracy cannot be learned overnight. It takes years. But when I see what the Kashag is doing, I think they are on the right track. It will take another maybe 10 years to be fully democratic, but already when there are elections, Tibetans living abroad, whether it be in India or in France or in America or in Switzerland, they can vote. And vote is one of the essential rights of the humanity. This is the universal values. And my view is that all over the world, the humanity can progress only by adopting these universal values. Of course, China is rejecting these universal values. There is, however, a Chinese place where the universal values have been adopted for decades. I mean Taiwan. Taiwan is the only democracy in the Chinese world since now more than 20 years, almost 30 years. When General Chiang Kai-shek went to Taiwan, when he was defeated by the communists, when he arrived in Taiwan, he imposed a very, very strict rule. There were thousands of deaths committed by the Kuomintang in Taiwan. But his son, Mr. Chongqing Guo, who took the presidency of Taiwan when General Chiang Kai-shek died, his son, injected the first uh, roots of democracy, and democracies did since then progressed all the way until today. Now we have the Taiwan president, Ms. Tsai Ing-wen, who is putting very bravely these universal values above, saying that we in Taiwan, we are a democratic country. So we hope that the free world will help us. And actually, she has some very now good answers from all over the world. United States, first of all. Uh, President Joe Biden has said many times that the United States support Taiwan by all means. If one day the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, dare to try to invade Taiwan, there would be a big reaction coming from the United States, but also from Japan, from Australia, from South Korea, and from India. So India is playing a very important role in that. And India is very well placed to know that the Chinese leadership is exerting coercion against India. The last border small war that happened in 2020 showed that the tensions between India and China are still continuing. So this is what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much for giving us a perspective of a journalist who has been in China and who has visited Tibet. And it was quite moving to hear you that you were allowed to go to Tibet on the terms that you will not write what you see. And still you had the courage to write. And then you had to suffer all those bindings from the Chinese government. But anyhow, as a journalist, I know very well that when you are suppressed, when you are forbidden from doing something good, it gives new courage and determination to you to do it not only more, but in a more organized way. So I
I
think,
would like to, I would like to say just one more sentence.
yes, yes,
That I make a very big distinction between the Chinese authorities and the Chinese people. This is
yes.
very much different. And actually, I have a big respect for the Chinese people. This is what I wanted to say.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yes, I think we all agree with you because I am one of those who would say that uh, we sympathize more with the Chinese people because they are suffering this communist regime. We are sitting outside and expressing our opinion, but they are suffering it directly. So our sympathies are with the Chinese people, and of course, they represent a wonderful culture. I'm sure our audience will have a few questions for you, but that will come later. So now I will request Dr. Qin Jin to please make your presentation. Dr. Qin Jin.
Uh, Thank you, Mr. Vijay Kranti, for having me for this webinar. First of all, I would like to take this opportunity to express my deep condolences to the young, talented Tibetan musician who set himself on fire for the freedom of Tibet. This is the 158th Tibetan self-immolation since 2009. Tibetans have set themselves on fire, hoping to awake the international community to address the Tibetan issues. But unfortunately, the West is basically indifferent. My earliest awareness of Tibet was the movie The Surf in 1964, and the stories about the customs of Tibetans learned from my relatives living in Tibetan Plateau. As early as May 1992, when His Holiness Dalai Lama visited Australia, I initiated a request For an audience with His Holiness Dalai Lama, a group of 7 people were offered a 3-hour audience in Sydney. That was my first audience with His Holiness. During the audience, His Holiness proposed a concept of the United Front, a fundamental magic weapon with which the Chinese Communist Party used to lecture the Chinese people as to how they defeated Kuomintang Chiang Kai-shek. Tibet used to be an independent sovereign state, survived over 1,000 years between China and India, with her unique language, political rule, religion, and culture. Tibet was annexed into Mongol in the mid-13th century when the Han Chinese Song dynasty was also conquered under the Kublai Khan. Tibet was then attached and detached from the dynasties of Proper China, Yuan, Ming, Qin. The Xinhai Revolution of 1911 overthrew China's last imperial dynasty to establish the Republic of China in 1912. All Chinese troops were expelled from Tibet, and the 13th Dalai Lama issued a proclamation that negated any form of a subordinate relationship between Tibet and China. Tibet actually enjoyed a de facto independence for 38 years from 1912 to 1950, with little interference. Tibet neither proclaimed itself to the rest of the world nor sought international recognition. Its self-isolation policy during these years caused it to miss the historical opportunity to obtain the status of a sovereign state. Communist troops invaded Tibet in 1950. A 17-point agreement which formalized China's sovereignty over Tibet was forcibly signed. Tibet sought for international support in vain. Only El Salvador voiced support by denouncing the Chinese military action. The remainder of the world was silenced. The 14th Dalai Lama was exiled to India with his 80,000 Tibetans in 1959 and formed the Tibetan government in exile, commencing the struggle for free Tibet, an arduous march in a long journey. In 1974, the Dalai Lama gave up the independence pursuit and put forward the middle way approach in the hope to achieve a double win between China and Tibet, purporting to enjoy a meaningful autonomy except for the diplomacy and the defense within the frame of the PRC. The middle way approach is not favored to the Chinese government. The Chinese government flatly rebutted it as essentially a political request for separatism. The Dalai Lama and his Tibetan followers have been consistently advocating the middle way approach as the principle of the Free Tibet movement around the world, which had attracted global attention. The 1989 Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to the Dalai Lama as a token of recognition to his peaceful and non-violent campaign that helped the Tibetans' aspiration receive more support from the West democracies and the non-governmental organizations across the world. Under the international political pressure, the Chinese government agreed to reopen the dialogue with Dalai Lama, which held 10 rounds from 2002 to 2013, even though the dialogue did not bring meaningful effect. I think Tibet was a victim of the evolution of the international political landscape. Without the CCP's rule of mainland China starting from 1949, Tibet could have maintained its de facto independent state. What caused this change? It was the Chinese Civil War. Who offered a free hand to the Chinese Communist Party's victory in the Chinese Civil War? That was Soviet Union and the United States. It was Stalin who supported the CCP in all aspects, and it was also Truman's China policy helped the CCP defeat Kuomintang. The CCP then became the perpetrator of harm in Tibet. Since 1959 Lhasa Uprising, Tibetans persisted their armed resistance against the CCP's repression for more than a decade until the CIA's aid was cut off in early 1970s, when the US Nixon administration adopted a new strategy in alliance with Beijing to contain Moscow. For this strategy, the US abandoned both Tibet and Taiwan. The middle way approach was then put forward that implies not to seek independence, but genuine autonomy within the framework of the PRC. The new page of Free Tibet saga was turned, enabling Tibetans in exile to reach their eventual goal. Tibetans have the world's prestigious spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, who has always raised the aspirations of Tibetans and maintained a moral image for the Free Tibet movement. His tenacious achievements has also raised worldwide attention to the hardship of Tibetans. I'm very regrettable to say we in the Chinese democracy movement lack a leader or group of leaders who are far-sighted, decisive, with a full sense of responsibility that resonates with followers. Initiated by the first audience with His Holiness, my own engagement in the democracy movement has been no longer limited to the democracy movement itself, but rather a purposeful interaction and cooperations with different political opponents of the CCP. Going forward into the future, every time the Dalai Lamas visit Australia, I would always have the opportunity of an audience with him. I have hosted His Holiness public speech to the Chinese diaspora 5 times in Sydney. In order to maintain and promote the cooperation between the Chinese democracy movement and the Free Tibet movement, I traveled to Dharamsala more than 10 times with delegations, or sometimes just simply by myself. The major powers in the world do not recognize Tibet as a sovereign state, and the most of exiled Tibetans are respecting the supreme prestige of His Holiness and willing to follow the middle way approach to seek a genuine and meaningful autonomy. However, the Tibetan independence movement is still a voice and has a certain influence. Objectively speaking, both the Free Tibet movement and the Chinese democracy movement mainly focused on human rights when confronting the CCP, calling on the international community to pay attention to human rights issues in Tibet and in China. This is the way to strive for the improvement of human rights. In response, leaders of the West democracies repeatedly persuaded Beijing to engage in dialogue with Dalai Lama, but there was no further progress. And there was little demand for the regime change, to push for change in China's political system. To do that, it is necessary to have actual strength to make this demand, and neither our democracy movement nor Free Tibet have it. Surprisingly, the United States and the West did not have the interest at all to help Chinese people to promote democracy in China, rather preferred to maintain cooperation with the CCP. They foolishly believe that with the development of China's economy, freedom and democracy would naturally come. This showed how ignorant of US presidents and elites of various kinds were about China and CCP. The Tibet issue has yielded no solution for over 6 decades. The core problem is the existence of the powerful CCP regime. I used to have different understandings with Tibetans on this issue. In my opinion, the achievement of aspiration of Tibetans can only be achieved after the disintegration of the CCP regime. Before the exit of the CCP from the stage of history, the Tibet issues cannot be resolved. The CCP is the unsurpassable obstacle. The Tibetan brothers did not agree with me, but very seriously believe that they might fruitfully fight to obtain what they want under the CCP regime. But anyway, I very much understand and support His Holiness Dalai Lama's middle way political line and strategy. Our pursuit for democratization in China is to promote the political transformation of the CCP in the presence of the CCP regime. As time went on, I became more and more perceiving that the CCP had no willingness of political transformation, especially with the support of the successive US administrations. The more powerful the CCP, the less willing it is to undergo political transformation. Not only that, but it has also expanded its ambition, hoping to replace the United States and the West as the new hegemon of the world. What should we do? Perseverance is the only way out. Even if the future is dark for the time being, we should still hold on, patiently wait for the light of dawn. As the saying goes, every cloud has a silver lining. The birth of the CCP is the result of the evolution of the world situation, and the might of the CCP is also caused by the factiousness and the incompetence of the US presidents. Flapping of a butterfly in Amazon forests can cause a storm in Texas, and a gunshot in Sarajevo in 1940 led to the rise of the communism in China. Truman intentionally or unintentionally assisted the CCP to win the civil war that caused Tibet to lose the statehood as a result. Nixon came to rescue the CCP to escape the Soviet nuclear attack to continue its life. Bush acquiescence to Deng Xiaoping's Tiananmen Square massacre. The CCP escaped the collapse, same as the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Clinton introduced the CCP into the WTO. The CCP became rich and powerful, now to pose a threat to the whole world. The Russian-Uranian war has kicked off changes in the world structure, and the post-World War II peace for nearly 80 years may come to an end, and the future evolution will be kaleidoscopic-like dizzy. The cloud of the Third World War is getting closer and closer, and Putin has the possibility of pressing the nuclear button after shamefully losing his face and militarily faltering in Ukraine. This is the worst. If the event goes another direction to be good, then the war may cure the numbness and the stupidity of the political ills of world leaders. We may see the future further decline of Russia after its military failure, and the bigger evil CCP will be isolated, cornered, and embattled. That will also trigger the collapse of the CCP. Here lies the opportunity for Tibet to achieve the goal to obtain the meaningful autonomy or regain the statehood. So does for the Chinese democracy movement. Russia is a friend to India, and China is an adversary to India. India's role and positioning is in difficulty between crocodiles and the deep blue sea. It is clear, however, that Moscow and Beijing had sufficient negotiations before the war broke out. Two evil forces have formed an alliance to advance and retreat in unison, to run rings jointly and severely around a weak, hypocritical, and morally subverted White House. The back-to-back tacit alliance of the two has already formed a new axis, and they would like to cooperate again to reshape the world according to their will. Despite of the overall strength weaker than that of NATO and the West, they dare to fight, estimating the West fear of causing a nuclear war and dare not to act decisively. Russia would act first in Ukraine and see what the White House, NATO, and the West do to Putin. If the West dares to confront Putin head-on, that could trigger the large-scale war. Going further down, it is directly associated with Einstein's compact weapons of the Fourth World War. When the United States and the West demonstrate their cowardness to retreat, which equalized to encourage Xi Jinping to stage a similar military adventure in the Taiwan Strait. Now that the world media has lost its objectivity and impartiality, we cannot just rely on what the mainstream media tell us to believe. We also need to use our own analysis and judgment to avoid being misled by the false information of the media. The current world is chaotic. The tyranny of East is evil, and the democracy of the West is also very lacking in justice. During the recent 2020 US presidential election and the current Russian-Ukrainian war, cautious and prudent public could perceive the mainstream media deliberately distorting basic facts and spread disinformation to cover up and whitewash the cowardice and the sinister darkness of the superficial representatives of the Western democracies. However, the world today is this: dark, evil, cowardness, and righteousness coexist. We are in uncertain times with unpredictable prospects. The world will either be reborn from the ashes or it will be destroyed if the Russian-Ukraine war is not stopped as soon as possible. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Qin Jin. It was really, I would say, a thought-provoking presentation, and your analysis about the the link between the American system and the Communist Party of China. That's very interesting, and I'm sure it needs a further discussion and further understanding by a wider audience. But I appreciate your particularly one point when you say that the the Chinese people who are striving for democracy, they are missing a leader like His Holiness Dalai Lama, and there need to be a united front between all those forces who are suppressed in China, whether they are the people of China itself or the colonies like Tibet, East Turkestan, which is Xinjiang, or South Mongolia, Hong Kong. Let us hope things turn out to be more hopeful and positive. Although what we are seeing today, as you said, the clouds are very dark, but you also said there is a silver lining. So let us hope for that silver lining. And thank you very much, Dr. Chinjin, for your very thought-provoking presentation. So now we come to Yuran Okatsang, who is, as I said, a prominent Tibetan, who is a very experienced person in advocacy, especially. And she has been very deeply involved in different Tibetan associations and the movement. So, Yuran Okatsang, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Vijayji Chase and Tibetan Youth Congress for having me on this webinar. It is indeed an honor to share the space with esteemed China expert Pierre-Antoine Donnet and Dr. Qin Jin. And I actually am thankful to both of you for giving this broad overview. Pierre gave this broad overview on situation inside Tibet and spoke about His Holiness's nonviolence, and then mentioned that but one thing that I want to beg to differ with Pierre is that Pierre was saying that he met with some TYC members and they were advocating violence. I do not agree with that. I think TYC is seeking independence, definitely, but not advocating violence. It could be some individual that you met in Dharamsala, probably, who it's a personal, individual kind of expression, I think, you know. And then I am a little bit... I cannot also help but dwell on the current global scenario, which is really dominated by a tussle between, you know, autocracy on one side and Western democracies on the other side. It looks like it's visibly Russia, but we all know that definitely China is also behind the scenes. China may have abstained from the UN Security Council draft resolution to end the Ukraine crisis, but it is simply treading carefully and calculating its risks, in the light of, I think it was very, very surprised to see the strong Ukrainian resistance and Western response to the war. But China has not, if you follow the news, has not sanctioned Russia, and nor has it recognized Russia's invasion. Russia's strongest ally, we all know, strategic ally, is China, and they share the same ambition. Like Dr. Qin said, it's an excess of power, like, autocratic power to establish their hegemony in a new global order. They want to carve a new global order away from the Western democracies. We all know that Xi Jinping is perhaps the only person who can convince Putin to announce ceasefire. And we heard from news reports that they had recent talks where Putin has actually expressed his readiness to kind of go for ceasefire negotiations. I hope that happens and there will be peace in Ukraine. China actually is using all its diplomacy. This is also, I think, in some ways, I do not know if this is, if China is not using it to its own advantage. It's using its diplomacy, all its abundant resources in the form of manpower, money, and military to really surge ahead, I think, in its quest to be the number one global power. However, the world is becoming increasingly wary of China's ambitions. Particularly, we know about China's aggressive stance in Taiwan, constant clashes along the borders it shares with India, and the ongoing disputes with the countries in the South China Seas, to name a few. We Tibetans have been struggling and suffering under the same autocratic and oppressive Chinese regime, the Chinese Communist Party. Like Dr. Qin said, we have to resist the CCP. It is actually under this Chinese Communist Party, when it came to power in China in 1949, then soon after coming into power, they marched into Tibet, overpowered the small Tibetan army stationed in Tibetan city of Chamdo, and invaded our country. Like Dr. Qin Jin said, Tibet was largely isolated from the outside world at that point, ill-equipped to fight foreign occupation. The closest ally that we could rely on, India, was newly independent from Britain, with little power or even the will to come to Tibet's rescue. And His Holiness, most importantly, was only 14 years of age. So PRC could not have timed its occupation better. China, going to China's historical claim, I think Dr. Qin did a very good job of drawing all the historical relationship between China and Tibet. China claims that it was that Tibet was always a part of China since the Yuan dynasty, which is about 800 years ago, right? But if there is a legal basis to that claim, so why did China feel the need to compel the Tibetan delegation to sign the so-called 17-point agreement on this of the Central People's Government and the local government of Tibet on measures for the peaceful liberation of Tibet? The liberation word itself rings, that is when most colonialists, when they come to invade a country, they use that word. We came to liberate you, right? Actually, the existence of a fully functional, de facto independent state of Tibet made China to kind of force Tibetans to sign that 17-point agreement. It was a legal necessity for China. So rather than liberate Tibet, this agreement actually bound Tibet for the first time to China. Before that, Tibet had historical relationships. There were Chinese influences. Yes, even British India and Mongolia also had influences over Tibet. Since the 18th century, there were actually Chinese representatives in Lhasa known as Ambans. But these Ambans were expelled from Lhasa, just like Dr. Qin mentioned in his presentation, with the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911. And since then, Tibet has clearly enjoyed de facto independent status. It is indeed unfortunate that we were not able to build on our international relations for recognition as a sovereign state. So while the agreement that China forced Tibetans to sign, the so-called 17-point peaceful agreement, it seems to exude this impression of maintaining the existing Tibetan political system in central Tibet. It gradually eroded the traditional Tibetan way of life, starting from eastern Tibet, leading to massive uprisings in Kham and Amdo in 1956, which gradually spread to central Tibet and then led to the mass uprising of 1959. As a result, His Holiness the Dalai Lama had to escape on advice of the coterie and the oracle, and 80,000 Tibetans, fled to India. And there was heavy clampdown on the uprising, where thousands of Tibetans were arrested, Tibetans were imprisoned. And since then, PRC, under the Chinese Communist Party that we are talking about just now, has ruled Tibet with an iron fist, cracking down with full force and heavy surveillance to preempt even any dissent from even occurring. So Chinese Communist Party is at the helm of making all these important decisions. No Tibetan has ever served as party secretary of Tibet Autonomous Region, the so-called Tibet Autonomous Region. The party secretary is the highest party position in TAR. Currently, it's Wu Yingji, who's about to retire this year, actually. He's already reaching the age of 65. But who will succeed him? Definitely, as always, yet another Chinese. And even in the TAR, within the TAR 7 prefectures, out of 7, there are only 2 Tibetan party secretaries. Whereas in the areas outside of TAR, there are no Tibetans at all. No Tibetan hold any top party positions. There may be a few Tibetan high-ranking bureaucrats, but these are co-opted and they are subservient to the party leadership because party is at the helm, right? So the bureaucracy is really there, but they are serving the party leadership. So what does it show? The absence of Tibetans from positions of power is really a proof of racism, discrimination, and China's deep mistrust of Tibetans. So Tibet's rich mineral resources, on the other hand, talking about environment, the waters, environment has been irreparably devastated with damming of all major rivers, sedentarization of nomads, and excessive mining just to feed the ever-rising Chinese greed. So the destruction of fragile Tibetan ecosystem has consequences not only for neighboring downstream countries when it comes to damming of the rivers, but also has effects on global warming. The everyday life, the Tibetan way of life, is also threatened with heavy imposition and influence of Chinese policies, which is aimed really at wiping Tibetan language, culture, and identity. The facade that the Chinese have maintained is that if you do not oppose the government or participate in any activities, quote unquote, endangering national security, prosperity and success is within your reach. However, Tibetans are denied even basic stuff like their own language, the right to study their own language, practicing their own religion, gathering for religious festivals and events, expressing their opinions on matters affecting their own lives, nurturing their unique Tibetan identity. We all have recently heard news of the demolition of the 2 Buddha statues in Khamdrango, Sichuan province, just as an example of where Tibetans are not even allowed to practice their own religion freely. This was demolished last year in December on the pretext that it did not acquire government approval. Many Tibetans were detained, including the abbot of the monastery, and there were reports that these people in detention were also going through re-education, and there was a huge clampdown in the area on social media. While social media used by the Tibetans are always constantly monitored, not just in Trango, everywhere else in Tibet, and censored, China also hires people to do counterattacks on those who, and then create fake accounts on social media to extensively really promote its propaganda, portraying a happy, prosperous Tibet. Even if there is some semblance of development, the question really is, who is benefiting from these? Are Tibetans really involved in any level of decision making or in these so-called developments? Tibetans are not. It's actually benefiting the Chinese more, right? Chinese workers are coming in, they're getting incentives to come and work in Tibet. Chinese are outnumbering the Tibetans in major cities of Tibet. So when it comes to freedom of expression and opinion, what has China been doing in recent times is really clamping down on all, whether you are artists, environmentalists, farmers, nomads, educationists, monks, or even simply devotees are monitored, their movements restricted, and if they do any expression of freedom or expression or opinion is cracked down upon. We just recently heard the news of Tsawa Norbu, who is a singer, a very popular artist, only 25 years old, who attempted self-immolation in front of the Potala on February 25th. We heard from the news that he was stopped very quickly and taken away by the police. And through the social media account of him, we now know that he is dead, he's no more, but we don't know the cause, the time, and the place of his death. In fact, all his songs have been removed from many apps, and his social media account has been deactivated because there's so many outpourings of condolence messages for him. Sewa Nobu is, in fact, the 156th Tibetan inside Tibet who has attempted self-immolation. So what are all the self-immolators demanding? They are actually protesting the Chinese repressive regime, demanding freedom for Tibetans and return of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to Tibet. The Chinese authorities have really targeted, just like Tsawa Norbu. Tsawa Norbu is an artist. So what is Chinese authorities doing at the moment? They are targeting and silencing influential Tibetans, whether they are writers, intellectuals, cultural leaders, because they view them as really hindrance in their policies of kind of integrating Tibetans into the so-called mainstream. So they have this huge campaign of cultural assimilation. So these people are hindrance, the intellectuals, the writers, the cultural leaders. We have heard about the case of Go Sharap, who is a Buddhist scholar, educationist. He's only age 46, and he has been sentenced to 10 years in prison by the Lhasa Intermediate People's Court in November last year. When he disappeared in 2020, we didn't know for 5 months where he was, until many Tibet supporters, Tibetan Human Rights Watch and organizations working for human rights demanded, and UN groups of experts, including the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention and Special Rapporteur on Religion, Freedom of Religion, when they inquired on his whereabouts in July 2021, then there was this, we learned after that he has been convicted again, quote unquote, of inciting separatism. So was the language rights activist Tashi Wangchuk and many other Tibetan intellectuals. Freedom House has once again ranked Tibet as the least free country in the world, alongside Syria and South Sudan. And for the past almost 6 years, Tibet has consistently been among the worst countries in the world when it comes to political rights and civil liberties. And one issue that I most importantly want to mention is the China's politics, that they meddle in reincarnation politics. I think it's most strategic Chinese move in the religious sphere, which is really the politicization and meddling of the reincarnation of the High Lamas. This has been a China has used this historically also, even if they were to gain influence over Tibet. They used this historically. So reincarnation law was passed in 2007 by the Chinese State Administration for Religious Affairs. And what does this law say? It maintains that all the reincarnations of tulkus of Tibetan Buddhism must get government approval. Otherwise, they would be deemed illegal or invalid. It further claims that reincarnation must be born within China's borders, and mandated the use of golden urn to select top-ranking lamas. They have been forcing this on the Tibetan lamas since 2007. And they have been doing lots of meetings where selected senior monks are required to study these policies and promise their support. We recently heard of party officials visiting in Sauk County as well. What we have seen is China's appointing of its own lamas, with the example of Panchen Lama, has not gone down very well. He still suffers from gaining any credibility from the Tibetan devotees, despite every effort put in by the Chinese to promote him. The same will happen to their meddling in any other appointment of High Lamas, and most certainly the Dalai Lama. It is indeed really ironic that an atheist and communist party is so hell-bent on meddling in the reincarnation of Tibetan High Lamas, of which they have very little or no knowledge except to control the country, because they know that Tibetans' hearts and mind is through the religion, and our identity is intrinsically linked with religion and culture. In 1962, coming to the Tibetans in exile, I wanted to kind of dwell on that a little bit also. In 62 years of being in exile, Tibetans have really made steady progress towards democratic governance. It was the vision of His Holiness soon after he came to exile, that we must have democratic system. Thanks to the generous support of India and from all international agencies, we were able to fulfill that vision of having a democratic governance in exile. Devolution of political power by His Holiness in 2011, despite very strong public appeals against it, has led to political leadership being directly elected by the people, while the system is faced with all the usual challenges of a young democracy. We are a movement to be reckoned with. As Dr. Qin Jin said, we have our political leadership is directly elected, but His Holiness still is our spiritual leader, somebody we see as a symbol of our struggle and the rallying force. So we are very, very lucky that we have His Holiness to always kind of seek advice and to help us in rallying support for Tibet. Tibetans in exile are scattered in more than 33 countries today, with a rough population of about 150,000. Today, we have actually over 64,000 Tibetans outside of the Indian subcontinent, India, Nepal, and Bhutan, and they're mostly in Europe and North America. While most of the Tibetans in India and Nepal are largely in settlements and under the direct administration of the Tibetan exile government, Tibetan diaspora outside are also connected via the various Tibetan associations we have. We have offices of Tibet under the Department of Information International Relations of the exile administration. And then there are the elected Tibetan members of parliament in North America, in Europe, and in Australasia. The Tibetan government in exile, particularly through the Office of Sikyong and the Department of Information, lobbies governments, parliamentarians, international agencies, including the United Nations. We have an office in Geneva whose main responsibility really is to lobby the United Nations. And we participate in all the various Human Rights Commission proceedings, make oral interventions, and there are civil society on. Basically, the government's main goal is resumption of negotiation with China based on the middle way approach. As was previously mentioned, under the leadership of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, we have had 9 rounds of talks with the Chinese counterparts between 2002 and 2010. Despite the fact that Tibet was historically never a part of China, our dialogue with Chinese counterparts seeks genuine autonomy for Tibet. We have cleared our stand by submitting a memorandum to the Chinese counterparts, but we have had a deadlock since 2010. As a Tibetan member of parliament, I think most importantly, I wanted to say what the Tibetan parliament has been doing. We raise the issue of Tibet in every parliamentary sessions and pass resolutions in solidarity with Tibetans inside Tibet and condemn Chinese oppressive policies in Tibet. We organize advocacy and campaign events, such as we also have the World Parliamentary Convention of Tibet. The first one was held in India in 1994. Since then, we've had 7 World Parliamentary Conventions of Tibet. The last one was in Riga, Latvia, which was attended by over 25 parliamentarians around the world. And there is a plan to hold one this year sometime in Washington, D.C. We also lobby parliamentarians to support the cause of Tibet, request them to raise our concerns in their respective houses, and pressure China to resume dialogue to find a resolution to the Tibet issue. Most recently, in December, the Tibetan Parliament was able to revive the all-party Indian Parliamentary Forum for Tibet. As you might have read in the newspapers, the political counselor of the Chinese embassy in Delhi wrote a letter to the Indian parliamentarians objecting to the participation of the Indian MPs at the dinner that Tibetan Parliament in exile hosted, the Speaker of the House. And they called, in the letter, what he said was, the political counselor, that Tibetan government in exile is an out-and-out separatist political group. And they mentioned that they oppose any form of contact by officials with them. So to that length, the China goes. So China, we are a sore thumb for China. China does see His Holiness, the Tibetans, the Tibetan government in exile, the Tibetan diaspora as a threat to their control in Tibet. They are concerned about Tibetans inside Tibet. They're concerned about Tibetans outside Tibet. Civil society in the exile community plays a prominent role in campaigning and advocating for Tibet. Among the ones directly involved in political activism are Tibetan Youth Congress, who is organizing, one of the co-hosts here, Tibetan Women's Association, Guchusum, National Democratic Party for Tibet, International Campaign for Tibet, Students for Free Tibet. We also have Tibetan language media outlets, Radio Free Asia, Voice of America, Voice of Tibet, Tibet Express, and Tibet Times, which covers issues affecting Tibet and Tibetans. And some even, like Radio Free Asia, VOA, VOT, they even try to broadcast into Tibet despite constant jamming and hacking of their websites by the Chinese authorities, by the Chinese hackers, Chinese government-controlled hackers. There are over, when it comes to Tibet support groups, we have more than 100 Tibet support groups spread over 50 different countries championing the cause of Tibet. And then each Tibetan also plays a role. We all, above the age of 6, we make annual voluntary contribution towards the running of our government, of our administration. The contribution is made and registered in a green book, which is also a document that proves that you are a bona fide Tibetan, irrespective of where you live or what citizenship you have. So all Tibetans above the age of 6 have a green book, and they pay annual voluntary contribution. This green book is also used for our elections. It's also used by Tibetans when they want to send kids to their Tibetan schools or get scholarships under the Tibetan government in exile, employment within the government administration. So Tibetan diaspora in many countries, whether in India or outside, they lobby their legislatures to support Tibet. They have lobby days, and they raise issues. They seek the legislatures to raise issues affecting Tibetans inside Tibet. Together, particularly with His Holiness as the rallying force behind all our efforts, we have made several milestones. I think just from the beginning, if we go right in the beginning, I think our elders, despite all the challenges they had, they were able to kind of work with other international supporters to gain 3 UN General Assembly resolutions, 1959, 1961, 1965. The 61 resolution, in fact, recognized the right to self-determination of the Tibetan people. There have been several resolutions, mostly in the US Congress, but also Italian, French Senate, and Australian kind of Congress resolutions. Most importantly, I think I would like to mention the Tibet Policy Act of 2002, passed by the US Congress, through which the position of the Special Coordinator for Tibet under the US State Department is also established. The main kind of responsibility of this person is really to promote substantive dialogue to resolve the Tibet issue. Uzra Jaya was recently appointed under the Biden administration to the post. There's also the Tibet Policy and Support Act of 2020, which is also important because it makes it very clear to the Chinese officials that if they get involved in naming the future Dalai Lama, they would face sanctions from the US. I think that was the main, for me, that was the main highlight. And then there is also the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act of 2018, where Tibetans or people going to Tibet should get the same reciprocity that the Chinese get when they come to the US. So we've had several resolutions in the US Congress. We've had some in the Italian Senate, the French Senate. Australia has had a Tibet motion. So some of the successful campaigns that we've had as all together with the help of not just the CTA, but also Tibet support groups, Tibetan organizations, Tibetans and individuals supporting Tibet are really, in the last few years, would be countering the mushrooming of Confucius institutes, which are actually meant to propagate Chinese thought and ideology. We've had also a successful campaign on climate action, Tibet Third Pole campaign. Panchen Lama campaign has been consistently going on and supported. And most recently, the Boycott Beijing Olympics campaign. So I think our success lies in the fact that we are able to challenge China's attempt to really whitewash its repressive policies, most particularly in Tibet and also in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. When it comes to Boycott Beijing Olympics, we were able to kind of form a solidarity network with our brothers and sisters from Xinjiang and Hong Kong. So, yes, we are dealing with the most authoritarian regime in the world, despite being under tremendous suffering, interrogation, and surveillance. Tibetans in Tibet have not given up their hope and struggle for freedom. Tibetan diaspora is also inspired by the courage and determination shown by the Tibetans inside Tibet. And we ourselves have a very heightened sense of Tibetan identity and spirit, which China can never crush, even if it uses all its might and resources. And we will we will triumph, and we have hope. I think hope is with us. I think that's what Dr. Chin left us with also. It was a little bit, he left a very gloomy picture, but I still want to hope, and I'm optimistic. Nothing is permanent. And I also believe that the party must be resisted. And if there is a democratic China, we have more hope. I believe that. So long live His Holiness and free Tibet. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Yurunla. You gave a very good, in addition to the a Tibetan perspective to history, you have given a very good introduction to what the exile community has been doing. Because for the outsiders, the biggest question is that even if the Tibetans living inside under Chinese occupation, even if they have limitations, so what about the Tibetans living in a free world? So your account of how the refugee community has handled itself despite such a small number, only 150,000, but its achievements, its contribution to promoting the cause of Tibet. Your presentation has been very reassuring, even to a person like me who has been watching the Tibetan scene for last 50 years. So thank you very much for giving this perspective, and especially your presentation on the aspect of how the Tibetan community is handling it inside Tibet and outside Tibet. So thank you very much. So in the meanwhile, our other friends, Yeshi Chompel, who is the cultural secretary of Tibetan Youth Congress, the co-host of this webinar. He is with us. Welcome, Yeshi Chopella. Thank you very much. You are here. And then we have Professor Ayushi Ketkar, who is assistant professor at the Special Center for National Security Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. She is an expert on international affairs and security affairs. She is an active colleague with us in Chase, and she normally handles question and answer sessions. I'm sure, Ayushi, you have taken note of some questions. Although we have very little time, but still, we'll have time for question and answers. And then we have our young researcher with us, our colleague Anjali Mishra, who is a young journalist. So, welcome, Anjali. So, yeah, before I give, uh, I ask Professor Ketkar a couple of points I want to make, which I think our will be addition to what has been already said. You know, especially China has been very actively running around the world and demanding governments and organizations and institutions that to accept that Tibet has been always a part of China. And whenever there is a mention, ever any mention of Tibet, Chinese government goes almost mad, demanding from individuals, from experts, from governments, from parliamentarians to mind their business because Tibet is an internal matter of China. So this issue needs to be addressed, especially on a day when we are commemorating 71st anniversary of people of Tibetan people's uprising. Because when you see the history in very short, this needs to be reminded to bosses in Beijing that they never had any control over Tibet. Tibet was never part of China. If they read history of China itself, and they will see that the last rule I repeat, the last rule of Chinese over China before 1912, when Republic of China was established, the last rule was 268 years ago. You know, China was under foreign occupation. They have been under occupation of the Mongols, of the Manchurians. The Chinese today are trying to tell the world that the Mongol occupation was not occupation. Mongols were rulers of China, and they were Chinese. So this is very interesting because Mongols occupied China and Tibet. So the Beijing regime wants you to believe that Tibet is a part of China because China was a part of Mongol regime and Mongols were great Chinese. You know, recently they were celebrating. I was traveling through China and on TV, I discovered they were claiming anniversary of the great son of China, Genghis Khan. You know, Genghis Khan becomes suddenly son of China, and Tibet becomes part of China because China was also part of the Mongol regime. In that sense, I think if we extend the logic, India can claim that Australia is part of India. But then New Zealand can also claim that India is a part of New Zealand because these three countries were under occupation of the British. So this logical, lame logic which China has been using to thrust its point that number one, Tibet is a part of China or Tibet is an internal matter of China. I think if any government, if any scholar, if any institution or anyone or any business house, if they shy away from speaking on Tibet only on the ground that we should not interfere because it's an internal matter of China, I think the minimum crime is that they are somewhere a compliance in colonialism of Tibet. And second point is, if none of them, any government in the world, if they cannot support Tibet because on the on the basis of historical facts, then I think in the world, no government has any right to write off the fate of Tibet in the hands of China simply because they are afraid of China. Now, please, you are welcome to be afraid of China. You are welcome to kowtow on anything. But no government in the world has a right to write off the independence status of Tibet to a third country, China. So this is one point I think which we should remember when there is any discussion on Tibet or when China is making noise on Tibet or on Xinjiang, which is East Turkestan, or on South Mongolia. I think China has to be told very clearly that none of these countries are part of China, and China has no right to, number one, remain in occupation of these countries, to suppress the human rights of these countries, and then to claim that the world should not interfere. So let us hope that the world governments will, at least if they can't support Tibet, they will not be in connivance with China to perpetuate the colonial rule of China over Tibet, over East Turkestan, over South Mongolia, and over Hong Kong. So now I think with this short intervention as moderator, I would request Professor Ayushi Kedkar, please come up with questions. Let us see if we can take maximum questions in next 10-15 minutes.
Thank you, Vijay sir. This has been a very enlightening and a very enriching talk by all the speakers on a very important topic. Yes, some of the questions can already be seen here in the comment section, and there's some more that have come on WhatsApp. So I quickly, Monsieur Pierre, the three questions to you are as follows. First, in which direction do you see the tension between India and China going? This was a question by Stanzin La. There's another second question is from Michael Hubert. He says that China and Russia are joining hands to extend the Belt Road Initiative with the final aim of attacking and destroying Israel. And he seeks your comments on that issue. And the third question stems from what you have mentioned in your talk, a very important point, the distinction between Chinese people and Chinese government. That is how, first of all, do you think there is a civil society in China? You know, how is the Chinese, do Chinese people have a voice? Because the Chinese government is so authoritarian and so dominating that do you think there exists a civil society or people's voice in China? And last and final question for you is, you have rightly mentioned how His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, shuns violence. But in that situation, how do you see, or where do you see the future of the Tibetan movement going? Because you are fighting an extremely violent China. So how do you see the future in such a scenario? Because the basic premise on which the Tibetan movement exists is on non-violence, but with non-violence, it's difficult to defeat China or win against China. So how do you see? Those are the questions for you. Dr. Shenzhen, for you, you've mentioned 2-3 points which have led to some very interesting questions. One is, you've made a clear distinction between complete independence and autonomy. You see autonomy as a middle path. So do you actually see the future of the Tibetan movement going in that direction? You know, where do you think this issue is, the issue of complete independence? Is that a foregone conclusion? Do you see that never happening? Second, you have rightly mentioned China lacks morally responsible leaders. So with that huge gap of having good leaders in China, where do you see the future of Tibet? Because China has made it very clear on this one China policy. So is this one China policy going to sound the death knell of the Tibetan movement once and for all? Yudanla, I hope to meet you in person soon, because being based at Dharamshala, there's a bigger scope for interaction between you, and I hope to see you at JNU sometime, giving that wonderful exposition of yours, because knowing ground realities, you have made some very interesting things, which as a scholar of international relations is, you know, it kind of ticks my gray cells. One is, you've mentioned the very important aspect of international recognition to Tibet. Okay. Do you think Tibet itself made a mistake? Tibetan leaders made a mistake in not seeking international recognition at the right time. You see, Taiwan at this point of time is working very hard to get international recognition. Do you think you've missed the bus on many occasions? I think Tibet had enough occasions, but might be you haven't been pushy enough to get that. So I would like your comments on that. And you've mentioned about blatant exploitation of Tibetan resources. Very true. And this new form of neo-colonialism, as you would say, how do you see this affecting tomorrow, even if Tibet gets full, complete independence, which is it's an uphill task, but even if it gets complete independence, how do you see this exploitation of resources, whether it's water resources, mineral resources, whatever the resources are, how do you think that would play out in true independence of Tibet? And last and final question.
Ayushi, because we are running against time, so I think already we have enough questions. Okay.
You can pick up any and short answer.
Right.
The last one is the politics of reincarnation. So where do you see countries like the so-called liberal world, US and all playing? Which side would they be in this politics of reincarnation? And that's it from my side, sir. Thank you.
Okay. So Dane, first you, please. You are muted. Please unmute.
Yeah. Okay. No, I think, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I will try to be as brief as possible, because there are 4 questions, very important questions that I could speak for hours about that. The first question, the tensions between India and China has been going back for a very long time. There was a war in 1962, which actually showed that the one who lost is the Chinese PLA. But Chinese expansion has been materialized in many other areas. China is encroaching territory of Bhutan, of Nepal. And if you see also the biggest picture, the South China Sea is also a very good example of China's expansion. Now, talking about the China-Russia relations, this is a very vast question. And what is happening now in Ukraine is really a big question mark for the Chinese leadership, because President Putin thought that the invasion of Ukraine would last just for a few days, and what happened is that the resistance of the Ukraine military men and women is very fierce. It will last maybe for another 1 week, 2 weeks, perhaps 3 weeks. So that led to the Chinese leadership to question their relationship with Russia. Of course, when President Putin went to Beijing on February the 4th for the opening of the Chinese Winter Games, he talked to President Xi Jinping for about 4 hours. And after this talk, there was a common communique which said that the relationship between Russia and China has never been so good. But behind the scene, it's very obvious that Chairman Xi Jinping is questioning himself what choice China has to make. Is it the choice for helping Russia, or is the choice to avoid being also a pariah on the international scene? Mr. Putin and his government are already a pariah in the West and in the whole world. So if China follows suit, the risk is for Chinese leadership to become also a pariah. So my opinion is that Xi Jinping is now taking some distance from Russia. Now, the third question, is there a civil society in China? This is difficult to answer, but what I feel is that, maybe these people now, they can eat. In 2020, the CCP announced triumphantly that for the first time in Chinese history, for the first time, the Chinese people don't die from hunger anymore. That may be true. But if you broaden the picture, you have the ultra-rich and ultra-poor. There are dozens of multi-billionaires in China who earn a lot of money. And you have on the other side, people, hundreds of millions of Chinese people who are on the side of the road. Civil society, I think there is one, because to eat is not enough for the people anyway. The humankind, of course, they seek to eat and to be self-sufficient in eating, but also what they need is spiritual life. Spiritual life is essential for everyone on this. And what is happening in China now for decades is that the CCP is fighting any religion, being it Buddhism, being it Islam, being it Christians. The only religion permitted in China is Xi Jinping's South. So that cannot last for a long time. Now, talking about nonviolence. Of course, Yondon, you're right. The Tibetan Youth Congress people now are most of them, almost all of them, nonviolent. But when I met them, that was back in 1986. At that time, it was a different picture. And I think, again, violence leads to nowhere. When you see what the Palestinian people, when they were using violence, what did they obtain? Nothing. So the only way is, as the Iranians say, is non-violence.
Thank you, Monsieur. Dr. Chen? You're muted, sir.
Yeah. Please unmute. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Your question is about the future campaign for Tibetan movement, about how to gain its meaningful autonomy and independence. my thinking is this: as long as the CCP is in existing, there is no solutions because the CCP is too powerful. Even though all the opponents of the CCP, like Chinese Democracy Movement, Free Tibet Movement, independence of Taiwan, independence of Uyghur people, and also Falun Gong, they are used to be called the five poisons by the Chinese government, and also the Hong Kong people. But all these forces united as one, which is still too small to compete with the CCP, because the CCP is so powerful. Now CCP is the number 2 in the world economically. I bear in mind I use CCP, not China, because I always like to have these two terms divided. The Chinese government, the CCP, kidnapped the whole nation to form a strong, very formidable power to compete the world. Why Chinese government could do that? Just because of the stupidity of the Western democracies, especially the United States. That's why I hate the United States for they just give Chinese people this disaster, also including Tibet. So without the removal of the CCP, there is no chance for Tibet. But how can we see the chance that the CCP could be removed? See the counter war. It might be the chance to have the butterfly effect. It might be, and hopefully. So that's why I use the in my talk I use the Russia and Ukraine war. Before that, before Chinese government was removed, there is no chance for democracy movement, for free Tibet movement. When CCP is no more, so China will get into a situation I call it a post-CCP China. At that time, I believe Tibet would have the chance to claim for its meaningful autonomy or even for its independence. Because when the Chinese government, communist regime is no more, I believe China will split apart to many different parts. That's the situation we will see in foreseeable future. So as a Chinese, I do wish China can still united as a big country, but the reality might be very, very likely when the CCP is no more, China will split apart. So there is also another theory that at that time, the international forces need to keep order in China to stop China getting into chaotic situations. So I think this is the scenario I could see that China's future. Tibet could only get the chance from there. This is my answer to your first question. The second question is about the leaders of the Chinese democracy movement. This was what I said. I don't mean the leaders of the Chinese leaders. Now Chinese leader is Xi Jinping, even though he was not elected by the whole nation. He was just nominated by the Chinese Communist Party. So the leaders of the democracy movement, we fail to have such a great leader like His Holiness Dalai Lama, even though we have someone who are quite prominent. They appeared from 1979 Tiananmen 1979 democracy war at that time, and also the 1989 democracy movement. There were so many young leaders, but after they were driven abroad in the United States or some other countries overseas, they failed to organize the whole group as a tangible force to fight against the Chinese communist regime. I don't blame them. The reason is very simple. The West democracies were not give support to the Chinese democracy movement. They just want to keep good relationship with Beijing. They naively believe the development of the economy, when China become rich, China will become democracy automatically. That's the naive thinking of U.S. President Bill Clinton, and also his another president of the Democrat. So that's the reason I believe the Chinese democracy movement could not produce a good leader. Not the Tibetans have a great leader, His Holiness Dalai Lama. He was not elected. He was just produced from the Tibetan culture. That's the totally difference. So if we look at the Falun Gong movement, they also have a big leader. All Falun Gong followers just listen to him. In Chinese democracy movement, we don't have such a kind of a situation, and we could not produce such a great leader. So this is the answer I can give you.
Ayushi, for lack of time, I'm going to make 3 very short points. Yeah, I want to say that I want to resonate with Pierre Antoine that we would like to make a distinction between Chinese people and Chinese government. Tibetan government does when it's talking about middle way approach. Also, we are always outreaching to the Chinese. We believe that they're not fed the right information. So I want to make that distinction. Secondly, I want to make kind of state that our movement is non-violent currently, whether it's a movement for independence by the Tibetan Youth Congress, or whether it's a movement that the middle way approaches the central government Tibetan administration is propagating. And the third thing that I want to say is the reincarnation meddling by China is actually with the aim to the future of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. They want to actually control the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. And it's very clear that many countries are sympathetic to what our stand is. Our stand is that we have passed resolutions, we have the High Lamas have met, the Tibetan public have already issued statements that reincarnation of the future Dalai Lama is the sole responsibility of the current Dalai Lama and the Ganden Phodang, the trust of the Dalai Lama. Yeah, so U.S. government has, as I mentioned, in its policy, Tibet Policy and Support Act of 2020, mentioned very clearly that the U.S. government, China can face sanctions from the U.S. if they interfere if they appoint future Dalai Lama. So that is the 3 things that I wanted to mention. And I think I might have missed out on the environment bit. If we have our own say in the matter, we will definitely put policies in place to ensure that there is no over-exploitation of resources. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we
Vijay.
have... Yes, Done, you wanted to say something? Yeah, please unmute yourself.
Yes. So yes, I just wanted to say that I understand why Dr. Qin Jin is saying so, because he's Chinese, so he's led to some extreme position. But I differ in the fact that when he says that foreign democracy will not help China to become democratic, I really think it's the opposite. Slowly, the West is waking up to what Chinese regime is. And this is very obvious. And when you say that you hate the American presidents, this is just very strange, frankly speaking. When you see what Joe Biden is doing, this man is 79 years old. He's taking very bright decisions for now since he came to power in the White House. And he said very clearly that Mr. Xi Jinping, now I'm on the road against you. And this makes a very big change in the United States position. It's the same from Japan. It's the same for India. It's also becoming the same for Europe. And when you say that you wish that the Chinese territories will falling apart, this is just terrible. I just don't agree. I think, of course, the Chinese regime maybe one day we will fall, that the CCP may fall. I think the CCP is doomed. But when that day comes, maybe that will be, I agree with you, then will become the chance for Tibet to regain its independence. Same for Xinjiang. But please, the rest of China should remain united.
Oh, thank you. That's a very, very interesting intervention to conclude, and it's very hopeful. I think it is also hopeful for my friend Qin Jin, that
Yeah,
things are changing, out in spite
I
of.
just want to say something
Yeah,
to
please, why not?
response to Mr. Pierre Antonio Doni. I don't know how to pronounce this your name properly in French. Yeah, that's the difference between totally different between you and me in looking at China. So I just say that quite again. I said that the problem is the Westerners fail to understand China. They fail to understand the CCP. That's the problem, because they have no such a culture. We understand China, understand the CCP. So only the Chinese expert Michael Pillsbury, he wrote a book, 100-year marathon, and I noticed that he's the only Western academic who understand the CCP, understand China, because he's a China expert for that long time. He received education in Taiwan, and he stayed in China for a long time. He noticed that, and the majority of the Westerners and the Western media people fail to understand China, and they just try to show people that they understand China very much. That's really, really sad. That's really, really sad. You don't understand what is Xi Jinping is thinking about when Chinese government they are doing something or make some gesture. We Chinese people understand immediately, understand what he's going to do. So that's why Li Denghui, the former the late president of Taiwan, he had a talk with me for about 2 hours and a half. He understood China very well, just because he had deep thinking. And I noticed that he's the best political leader after Jiang Jingguo in Taiwan. And the rest, another 3 people, Ma Ying-jeou, Chen Shui-bian, and Tsai Ing-wen, they are far behind him. But Taiwan is doing quite well because Tsai Ing-wen is doing very, very well. When 2 years ago, when Xi Jinping made a claim to oppress Tsai Ing-wen to go to the unification, Tsai Ing-wen immediately made her response. That made Tsai Ing-wen to be re-elected. From that time, I don't think you could understand the feeling and the thinking of Chinese people. We understood that. So that's why Chinese government tried to hold the whole country tightly, very tightly. They understood if they lose the power, if the CCP lose the power, look, that all people, like the people in Tibet would have the chance to go away, and the Uyghurs would go away, and the Mongolia will go away. That's the situation. That's the scenario. So lots of Chinese people could see that, but I don't understand why don't you see that? You think it's a very radical scenario. But it is now the situation is just gradually coming. So that's why when I saw the war on the 24th of February. That evening, immediately I thought, oh, something started to change. Why Chinese Communist regime could stay in China? Just because the First World War. The First World War, the German emperor gave money to Lenin to go back to Russia to start a revolution. So the revolution succeeded. Then they have the communist regime in Russia. Then they started to replant the communism in China. Without Lenin, Chinese people would go very well, smoothly, China has already got the democracy at the time. So that's the situation, because something happened. That's why I used the butterfly effect. So this butterfly effect could be two ways. The worst way is the whole world will be demolished. This is very, very worst. The good thing is Russia was declined, and also the CCP would be the only target to be embattled
Yes.
by the whole world. By the whole world, this is a good thing. But you trust Biden. Biden is just a stupid guy, stupid old man. So
No.
let Biden get in.
You
We just
exaggerate.
chance just
I think we can agree, Dr. Shin. I think we can all agree that we need to wake up to the Chinese ambition of hegemony,
Yeah,
of carving this global order, and we need to all consolidate our powers together.
Yes.
Yeah, we have to
and address this
I'll wait for
autocratic,
the chance.
authoritarian
Chin.
regime. Yes,
Dr.
Yes.
Chin,
I think we should
just
agree on
one
this.
sentence. The winds are changing direction.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, I think that's here what I see a very big meeting point, a common ground between all of us is that things have been very much favorable to China and to CCP over past 70 years, but things are now changing, and there are seeds in the new air, in the new environment, which can lead to the change which the whole world is looking for, to see the end of CCP in China and relief to the people of China and to those colonies who have been occupied by China. So I think since we have already jumped our time, this is time to request our friend Yeshi Chompel. Uh, he's the cultural secretary of Tibetan Youth Congress, and in himself, he's a senior Tibetan young leader, to please say a vote of thanks. And I'm sure today's discussion has given us so many new ideas to think further. And very soon we'll meet with some new subjects. So I request Yeshi Chopella to please give vote of thanks for today.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and translate to you all. And we just can I conclude or what?
You please give vote of thanks. And if you have any comments, please
Okay,
feel
okay,
free. Yeah.
okay. Translate to you all. With this, and we came to the end of webinar, and this webinar wouldn't be possible without our support and cooperation for our invited speakers. As therefore, I, on behalf of TYC and just extend our sincere gratitude and thanks to our speaker, those speakers who spoke about the Tibetan National Uprising Day, which is 10 March, and inside the situation and outside the situation and surrounded the situation and lots of situation happens in this webinar. Thank you for this. And first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Qin Jin for taking your time to take part in this webinar. And secondly, I would like to thank Dr. Sir Donis, for your support and accepting our invitation to take part in this webinar and to share your experience, to share your knowledge, to share your. You've been in Tibet, you've been in India, then that's lots of experience you shared. Thank you for that. Next, Kungo Yudu Uwar Sangla, a member of Tibetan Parliament, for being so supportive in our activities and in our organization, and especially, and she talked about strong and sensitive thought and on in this webinar. So thank you very much, Kungala, and I thank Vijay Karandiji for being so active in organizing our joint webinar as always and as always. And sir, you being a very friendship to our organization till decades and decades. And today taking part of this webinar and very from bottom of my heart and from bottom of my organization's heart. Thank you, sir. And next, thank you, Professor Kritigiji, for being an active organization. No, for being an active and care question and answer and contributing your own intellectual and capacity to today's webinar. And thank you very much. And until last, Anjali Mishra ji, if I'm not wrong, you've been, that webinar and Nobel Peace Prize
Yes,
this
yes.
webinar.
Yes.
Yes, for sharing your time webinar like this, and thank you very much. And try to spread more time in webinar like this and next time. And finally, I would like to thank you, Mr. Lobsang Setenla,
Yes.
who is working in Tibetan Action Institute and for taking care of technical part of this webinar. And thank you all. And I got a very much knowledge, and I got a little much uh, part of my history that I don't know. And that's why thank you and so much and free to back.
So thank you very much, all participants, the panelists, and I hope that that today's thought-provoking interaction is going to lead us to uh, fresh interactions in the future. And I hope our friend Done, Qin Jin, we will have the privilege of being to have you again with us in our some of
Thank
our
you.
next webinars. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
you
you.
to
Thank you
all
so
of you.
much.
Thank you.